my next guest. I have here with me today Mr. Oleksiy Harain, and he will present a research of Democratic Initiatives Foundation. The presentation is called After 2020, How COVID-19 Pandemic Influenced Pro-Russian Agenda in Ukraine. This is the best introduction to the next panel. Oleksiy, welcome. Welcome, thank you for having me. Oleksiy, you actually have the chance to answer this question. So, the Russian propaganda is indeed making use of the vast toolbox in its propaganda warfare against Ukraine. And I'd like to draw your attention to the first diagram that we have in place. I don't see if the slides are actually there. The audience will see the slide, Oleksiy. We can actually see it, but it's going to be the next slide. Yes, thank you, Ina. So, could you please put the first diagram on screen? Yes, the next slide, please. So, we assessed the attitude towards vaccination. Have you carried out the research before the vaccination process was rolled out? We measured it across different times, this February, last autumn, and in April, respectively. Oh, there you see the slides. So, orange line there stands for 29%. People who don't believe in vaccines' efficiency. This is almost 30%. Another almost 20% don't have faith in Ukrainian healthcare system. And this is a reason for our major concern. Yes, this is the February data. And obviously the Russian propaganda is trying to build on that. The next figure is here. So the attitude towards different vaccines. Positive and negative mentions in the media relating to different vaccines. The blue lines represent Pfizer and AstraZeneca. In January, an announcement came. These vaccines were shipped to Ukraine, and we see a surge of positive mentioning in the media. So it was a very powerful effect. Ukraine is receiving help. What happens next? March and April, we see a drop in the balance between positive and negative evaluation. The total sentiment is positive, after all, but you see that it plummeted because of what Russian propaganda did. Even though the channels directly controlled by Medvedchuk were shut down, but nevertheless, even those remaining channels still spread the information, even those who don't belong to so-called the pro-Russian holding company. Oleksiy, but who is pushing this message? Well, you know, mostly it was pushed by Medvedchuk companies who have been shut down now. But you see, it's also in the media. Social media are creating this tension and are trying to hype up vaccination. They're saying you shouldn't get vaccinated, that allegedly the Western vaccines aren't effective, hence the plummeting. So initially, it was received positively. And the most positive balance to trust versus mistrust was towards Covishield, AstraZeneca, and Pfizer. But we see that this balance was upset. Could you please elucidate on the Sputnik line on this diagram, Oleksiy? Am I right in understanding that the Russian efforts mostly sought to create a negative reputation for Pfizer as opposed to supporting Sputnik? Well, this is the line of Sputnik vaccine, the Russian vaccine. It's quite stable. No ups and downs there. However, the balance of positive and negative evaluations is almost zero. So the positive evaluation is somewhat dominant because, you know, it's a vaccine it's against, but it's held in less positive regard as opposed to the Western. This is Johnson & Johnson line, but, you know, people don't know much about it yet. Therefore, people are less enthusiastic about this vaccine. The next slide, please. In assessing the general sentiment towards vaccination, this is what we see. It's a way to divide and sow discord between the local and the central government. Please, the next slide, not this one. As you can see, both in September and in January, if the local government had wanted to lift lockdown restrictions, then there would have been a big split in the society, and the majority would have been in favor of lifting restrictions. The central government is imposing restrictions, and the local government says, no, we oppose, we're going to live though. And unfortunately, the ordinary citizens would support that. You see the first two columns here and there. What does that mean? That populism is sadly winning, and that the local government is trying to gain some dividends. Next slide, please. And in conclusion, the impact of the Russian propaganda is not limited to such questions as COVID or the tension between the central government and the local government. Russians continue operating in their traditional field, such as the language policy, history, geopolitics, etc. But here we see important achievements. We want to provide some good news for the audience. The support for the Eastern vectors, i.e. the vectors to join the Eurasian Union, is only supported by 10%. Before 2014, there was a split. It was a divisive issue, should we support the East or the West? Now there has been a dramatic decrease in the support of the Eastern vector. 71% of Ukrainians think that Ukraine is at war with Russia. Not the civil war conflict, as conflict would have us believe, but they believe this is war. There has been significant progress vis-à-vis the language policy. I'm going to name the figures. 80% of Ukrainians need to speak Ukrainian, that during their work time the senior management should use Ukrainian, and the schooling needs to be in Ukrainian. It's somewhat less, it's 54% when we say the use of the Ukrainian language of the businesses. This is new. People think that you would be forced to buy things using the Ukrainian languages, but tectonic shifts have happened vis-à-vis the historic memory policy. There's this notion that the Third Reich and the USSR are responsible for the beginning of World War II. Fantastic figures, 50% agreed. We thought there was a mistake. This year, we asked the same question. And we have seen that practically half of Ukrainians believe that the USSR, not Russia, USSR and the Nazi Germany are mutually responsible for starting the war. And just another figure, because it's a stark contrast to what is happening in Russia. Almost 80% of Ukrainians think that war would have not been possible to win if it wasn't for the anti-Hitler coalition. And this goes totally against what is said in Russia. Putin's regime denies the responsibility of the USSR, and they want to criminalize that. And they also say that they allegedly could win without the allies and without Ukraine. So this has indeed been a dramatic shift. Alexei, why has this happened? Well, I think one of the causes is that we know more now. We have a greater knowledge. There are different media reporting on that. And the media, not only the patriotic media, but also the media that are allegedly controlled by the oligarchs, they also have those narratives in place. But the key factors is what happened after 2014, the Russian aggression demonstration that Putin is not to be trusted.
I believe this is not just the Ukrainian context, but an international war, because these history wars are waged in Ukraine and on the European arena as well. If Ukrainians are getting more information and becoming more critical when assessing the past events, the discourse in Russia hasn't changed. In its international platforms, Russia is still propagating the same narratives. So how do we prevail on the international arena how do we beat the historical myths? I believe we need to spread the information. Ukraine is not participating in the memory war. This is what Russia is doing in full disregard of the real historical fact. But there's an important message to the Ukrainian governmental official, something that may not go down well in the West. It's about commemorating the tragedy of Babi Yar, which is a common tragedy for Jews and Ukrainians and others. My grandma was Jewish, and all her relatives perished. She was the only one who survived as she was evacuated. This hurts me a lot, and I have the right to say so. There are two ways to commemorating the Babi Yar in Ukraine. One developed by the State Academic Institute of History, supported by the experts, Ukrainian and Jews alike, and the second, which is a so-called private project, which is promoted by 3 Russian oligarchs, which we have not seen, but they have already started an illegal construction, and they're building on a cemetery, they're building on the bones, which is prohibited by the Jewish laws and just by humane laws. The construction is conducted illegally, and I would like to use this opportunity to attract the attention of the Kyiv mayor and the Kyiv city administration to the problem. So what are the red lines or the markers that we should be following with this project? We need to follow the law unwaveringly, and the president has supported the private project. He appointed the head of the working group, a person from his secretariat. He refused to meet the people advocating the public project. So my first beseech to the president and to the government, why don't you give the developers a chance to present it? And secondly, when we are building such a tragic memorial in a national reserve law, we have to do so consistently with the national law, and the government should hold the majority shareholding. It shouldn't belong to the Russian oligarchs, but it should be owned by the Ukrainian state. So, as far as I know, we should be using the supervisory councils as a way to monitor. We need to have a public steering committee to monitor the project. Russia is going to use it for its narrative. Any development around Babi Yar will be used to discredit the role of Ukrainians in World War II or the role of Ukrainians these days, saying, oh, they don't want to to commemorate the Babi Yar tragedy, and they want to misappropriate. It's a tragedy for the Jewish people and for the many other nationals who perished in Babi Yar. It's a global problem, and if this discourse can attract attention to the issue in good time, perhaps we can prevail by explaining. The time is limited. The tragedy which happened in late September is approaching fast, and those private builders are racing ahead with the construction is done illegally in disregard of the Ukrainian laws and public opinion. The calls on the government to create an urgent council for the public project could include the representatives of the private project too, and our request to President Zelensky to support the initiative instead of appointing one project implemented by Russian oligarchs. Going back to the issue of disinformation and building a bridge into the following detailed panel to follow our conversation, I'd like to pose you a question. How would you What flagrant myths would you identify that are propagated by Russia against Ukraine, both modern Ukraine and Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union? Well, they would say that we are nationalists, fascists, and anti-Semites. I can see it, your words quoted on the media. Well, apart from Israel, we can fully rebut the myth that we are anti-Semites. We need to talk about the complexity of World War II. It's no easy narrative, but it's doable. There's a good generation of analysts and historians who can really sort it out. In the laboratory of journalists, together with our British colleagues, Peter Pomerantsev and Internews Ukraine, we conducted our own study. How do we transition from the memory to a constructive dialogue about history? And let me make a small teaser for the next panel. As I'm sure is going to be brought up during the next panel, we should talk why these myths go down into the values held by Ukrainians and how do we see ourselves in this context. I'd like to thank Alexei Harань for his data, for sharing the good news with us. I'd like to thank you now and bring in the moderator for the next panel. Oksana